Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back on an episode of Cheap Shots. This is a series that is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, episode number 70, we're going to show you how to cheaply and quickly paint the Gwaka'Moli Crater Gators, which is a Lizardmen team for Games Workshop's Blood Bowl. And as you can see in this photo, this is exactly what the team will look like when you are finished. And assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time using our Cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total investment of $33.17. And when you compare that with the savings, as opposed to buying materials from Games Workshop, Citadel Paints, as well as Army Painter, you end up talking about a grand total savings of $190.17 if you decide to go with the Cheapskate method. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this video on a roll and show you guys how to cheaply as well as quickly paint up your Gwaka'Moli Crater Gators. Alright, so first of all, the first thing you need to do with your miniatures after you decide to assemble them as well as to base them with some texturing, the first thing you need to do, of course, is a primer. Now, when it comes to my painting, I like to use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I can buy this stuff at my local Walmart for $3.99, and all I do is I just give it the quick once over by spraying primer all over the miniature. Now, priming does a couple of things that kind of helps out the whole painting process for your miniature. Now, the first thing that primer does, it actually gives an uneven, kind of rough texture to the surface of your miniatures. And the reason why is because if you were to take acrylic and paint it directly onto bare plastic, what would end up happening is that the acrylic paint has nothing to adhere to on the smooth plastic. So because of that, any form of friction whatsoever will rub the acrylic paint right off the miniature and absolutely ruin your finish. So because of that, by using primer to act as a buffer, the primer actually gives the acrylic paint a surface to adhere to, which allows the paint to stay on the miniature. So that's the first thing that it does. Another important thing that primer does is that the color that you use to prime your miniatures will often have a huge impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you're using on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, if you want to go with a more brightly colored, vibrant color scheme for your miniatures, you want to use a white primer because the white will help to create that vibrancy in your miniatures. Black, for example, if you use a black primer, will dull down the vibrancy of your colors, which is great especially if you're using darker color schemes for your army. And of course, if you use gray, it's just a nice little medium in the center. Now, because we're doing a quick paint method, meaning that we're going to use an oil wash for our miniatures, I like to use a white primer because it creates the colors and makes it very, very vibrant. And the reason why is because the oil washing process will actually mute down the value of those colors and actually take away the vibrancy, and that's the reason why I like to use a white primer to do that. So now, once you get your primers done, the next thing you need to do, of course, is start working on the flesh of the miniatures with some base coats. So the first thing you do, of course, is to paint up your miniatures. Now, for this specific team, we wanted to actually create a lot more color variety in the team. If you can see the background, you can see the box art for the miniatures, and that's actually what I was using to kind of get my inspiration to paint up this team. The problem, though, is that if we decide to go with the paint scheme from the box art, it looked very monotonous, and it also really drew out the fact that the team actually has duplicate sculpts inside of it. And so because of that, we didn't really want to do that. So in order to create the illusion that there's a lot more variety of sculptures in the team, we decided to do some alternating color schemes by using different colors for different players. So as you can see in this photo, for 3 of the Source Warriors as well as for 2 of the Skink Warriors, I decided to use Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a simple, cheap paint that you can get at Walmart for 50 cents. Just put 2 thin layers all over the softer flesh of the miniature as well. In fact, if you look at that skink in the front row on the right hand side from the green ones, you can see his the palm leaf green is a little bit darker, and the reason why is because I originally painted that guy to be turquoise, just like the other lizardman on the right, and I didn't care for the fact that it was looking too uniform, so I decided to put palm leaf right on top of it. So that's why it's a little bit different looking than the rest of the team for that reason. Now, for another 3 Saurus Warriors as well as 2 more of the Skink Warriors, we actually painted those guys up using Tahitian Blue by Delta Serum Coat. I get this color at my local Hobby Lobby. It cost me about 65 cents. And I just put 2 thin layers of that turquoise to get that nice, vibrant turquoise soft scale look that is so iconic for Lizardmen miniatures. Now, as for the were alligator that I have on the right hand side, that were alligator is going to be the proxy for this team's Croxagore. I use wintergreen by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice, vibrant, spearmint type of green, just so that way he's a little bit different looking than the other green miniatures, and kind of gives him his own little color scheme. And then lastly, I use Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. I use this to create the color for the chameleon skinks. Decided to make a bright kind of orange color, and the reason why is to signify the fact that they're kind of like, you know, like their own little group within the team, so to create that variety of color. Now, you don't need to be particularly neat at this stage. You just want to make sure you have a good even coverage of the flesh color all over the soft flesh of the lizardman, and once you're done with that, putting those two thin coats on, time to move on to a dry brush. So the next step is to do a quick dry brush real quick on the flesh of the miniatures. Now for the miniatures that were done in palm leaf as well as wintergreen, I decided to dry brush them with lime sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just did a really quick dry brush all over the flesh to create the illusion of depth on these miniatures. Now when it comes to dry brushing, what dry brushing actually does is that you actually take a paintbrush and you actually dip it in the color that you want to use as a dry brush, and what you do is you wipe it directly onto a napkin or a paper towel until there's barely any paint left on the brush. Now the reason why I do this is because that way when you dust your miniature with your dry brushing, the pigment that's left behind on the individual fibers adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniatures, and it creates highlighting, giving that illusion of depth in your miniature. The darker base coats will stay inside the recesses of the miniature, while the dry brushing will catch the highlights of the raised surfaces of the miniature to create that highlighting look. And traditionally speaking, when you use a dry brush, what you want to look for is a color that is more pastel version of the base coat to create that illusion of depth as well as highlighting on the miniature as well. Whenever you do dry brushing, it's always a good idea to work in layers of dry brushing because it is always easy to add more additional brightness and definition to your miniatures, but it's very, very difficult to go back. In fact, if you don't like the brightness of your miniatures, you basically have to start the whole process all over again by base coating and then dry brushing again. So always work in layers to whatever degree of brightness that you want. Now I do exactly the same thing with my chameleon skinks. I use Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And then for the miniatures that are done in turquoise, I use Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this color at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. And once you have the dry brushing done for your miniatures, next thing you do now is start working on some of the finer details. So the next step is another base coat. This time we're focusing on our skink warriors, and the reason why is because the skinks have these beautiful head crests that are on the top of their heads there. Now to add some variety to this team, I decided to actually pick out the membranes of those head crests in two thin layers of taupe gray by Adidas acrylic. You can find this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. And the reason why I like this color is because that kind of grayish flesh kind of contrasts nicely with the greens as well as a turquoise that we use on these miniatures. And so I just put two thin layers of this stuff directly onto them. Now you do have to make sure that you're a little bit neater when applying this paint because the membranes of the head fans have like these little appendages that kind of go through it as well. And if you do make a mistake and you kind of paint that over, it's not a big deal. You could just knead up with some base color with palm green for the green ones as well as Tahitian blue for the turquoise ones. Put two thin layers of that taupe gray and you're ready to move on now to the harder scales that are on the miniature. So the next thing we're going to work on now are the armor scales that break up the back of the miniatures, where we're going to be focusing on this one. Now for this one, traditionally you want to go with a darker color for most cases. So for example, for the Croxagore proxy we have on the left hand side, I use English Ivy Green by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just put two thin layers along the top of the back of the shoulders, as well as the top of the snout, as well as the tail for that harder armored scales that they have on the backs. Now for the chameleon skinks, I use Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel Paint in order to break out those back panels for them. Now for the Saurus warriors that are done in green, I decided to use Holly Branch by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs you about 50 cents at your local Walmart. It's a nice, vibrant kind of Christmas looking green that contrasts very nicely with the palm leaf that we use for their softer flesh. As for the turquoise Saurus warriors, for two of them anyways, I actually picked that out in bright blue by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And I just put that on two thin layers for those guys. And for the rest of the skinks, as well as for one of the Saurus warriors, we actually picked out those back scales in Anita's acrylic true red. Once again, it's my very favorite red color to use for miniatures painting. It's a nice vibrant red, does a really good job, applies very neatly. I can't say enough good things about that product. I really love that for my reds and my miniatures. And the reason why we did that for one of the Saurus Warriors is because the guy I'm painting this up for is going to be playing this team. He wanted his team captain to have the red scales, which is the Saurus Warrior, over there on the right hand side. So because of that, I just picked out 2 thin layers of that for all of them, so that way he has that differentiated character for his team. And once you're done with the back scales for these guys, the next thing you do now is a dry brush. Now, when it comes to the dry brush on these miniatures, we're focusing on the back armor scales that we have done for all of them. Now, for the miniatures that we've done with Anita's acrylic true red, we're going to dry brush those real quick with flag red by Apple Barrel Paint. Flag red is kind of like a nice off reddish color, almost kind of like a reddish orange, and does a really good job with dry brushing on the scales. So you can see there I applied the scale of the Saurus Warrior, as well as the 4 skinks that are on this team. Now, for the miniatures that we use, the darker blue for their hardened scales, we use Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. It also costs 50 cents at your local Walmart, so that way we can crash those raised surfaces and create that illusion of depth on their scales. Now, as for everybody else who has done with green, I used, regardless of what green I used, I dry brushed them all in the same color, which is lime sherbet. And as you can see, it's a very bright, vibrant pastel green color. So that's the reason why you want to use this sparingly and to actually work in layers, so that way you don't overwhelm the miniature and still keep a lot of that darker color in the recesses. And once you're done with the dry brushing, the next thing you need to do now is start working on the clothing. So the Lizardmen for the Gwaka'Moli Crater Gators all are actually wearing gym shorts, which is actually kind of cool. So because of that, I decided to stick with the original color scheme that is on the box art. We're going to give them black trunks with yellow lining on the outside of the legs of their shorts. So to do that, I decided to pick this out 2 thin layers of pavement by Apple Barrel Paint. Now, pavement is actually not black. It looks like it's black, but what it really is, it's a very, very, very dark gray, almost to the point of being black. But the reason why I like using pavement so much is because it actually has kind of a bit of a gritty texture inside the paint, which is fantastic for dry brushing, because that grit in that black paint will do a fantastic job of adhering dry brushing pigments to it, and that's the reason why I like using it so much. So for the pavement, all I do is I just use 2 thin layers of pavement on all the gym shorts of the miniatures, which contrasts nicely with the brighter colors that we've been using up to this point. Once you get done with that, next thing you do now is a dry brush. So for this step, I just do a very light dry brush using Pale Gray by Folk Art. It's a beautiful pale gray color, does an excellent job of actually adhering and creating the pigments adhering to the raised surface of the miniature. That way you can see the folds of the fabric on the gym shorts, does a really, really good job on that part as well. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. That's my very favorite pale gray to use for my miniatures. Once you do that really light dry brush, the next thing you do now is start working on some more details. So for the details that we're working on next are going to be things like the feathers. They're on the headdresses of these miniatures, as well as the stripe that's going along the leg of their gym shorts as well. Now to use this, I'm using King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. All I do is I just pick out those lines that run along the length of the gym shorts, as well as the feathers of the head crests on the Skink Warriors, at the same time at the loincloths that are being worn by some of the Saurus Warriors as well. Let's just put 2 thin layers of that King's Gold. It's a nice contrasting color with the greens, the blues, the oranges that we have for this team. At the same time, I also take the same color and I also apply it to the eyes in the miniatures, and so to create kind of like this kind of glowing yellow eye look for the Skink Warriors as well as the Saurus Warriors. Now for the Saurus Warriors as well as the Croc Score, you just need to put a single dot on that stuff. Just do 2 thin layers of that to pick out their eyes. But for the Skinks, their eyes are actually quite much more prominent. They're like salamanders in that sense. So because of that, I just made sure it was really, really neat when I applied the paint onto the eyes of the skinks. And yes, I will be drawing like a slit in black on the eyes as well to create that like cat eye, lizard reptilian look for their eyes as well. So when it comes to the feathers as well as the loincloths of these characters, I decided to pick those out with a dry brush real quick using Sunny Day by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs about 50 cents at your local Walmart. It's very much like a canary yellow and does a beautiful job of actually catching up the raised surface of the miniature. So like the actual individual fibers and filaments of the feathers, for example, the folds of the clothing. All you need to do is, of course, is just to dry brush these miniatures with the yellow elements with Sunny Day to the degree of brightness that you prefer. And once you're done with that, move on to our next set of fine details. So the next thing I started working on next is, of course, on all the elements that are done in pink on these miniatures. Now, there actually isn't very much pink on these guys. Primarily, it just kind of focuses on the mouths is what I'm really doing. Some of these Saurus warriors, as well as the chameleon skinks, their mouths are open. So to pick out the gums and the flesh of their mouths, I just put 2 thin layers of bright magenta. It's a nice, bright magenta color that you can get from Apple Barrel from Walmart. It costs about 50 cents. Once you do that, you're ready to move on to the dry brush for their mouths. Now, for most of the Saurus warriors, as well as the Croxagore, their mouths are so small you really can't do much of a dry brushing, so I skipped that mainly for those guys. I'll just use the bare magenta for those guys. But for the chameleon skink whose tongue is sticking out catching the Blood Bowl football, his mouth is actually quite dominant, so because of that, I decided to pick that out in dry brushing with Cameo Pink by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs you about 50 cents to local Walmart. It's a beautiful cotton candy pink color and does a beautiful job of putting out the raw surfaces on the tongue, especially on that little chameleon skink there as well. So the next detail we're going to work on next are all the fangs, the claws, as well as the spines of these lizards as well. There's actually quite a bit of that stuff on all the Saurus warriors, as well as the Croxagore and the skinks. So to pick out those those spines as well as teeth and claws, we use Khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just put 2 thin layers of this stuff all over the mouths of the miniatures, as well as their teeth, their spines, as well as their claws. You might need to be a little bit more careful when it comes to applying this paint onto the fangs that are being exposed by the warriors, so that way you don't worry about messing up your magenta paint job. Just really simple that way. Same thing with the Croxagore there in the center. Pick out his claws on his feet and his hands, as well as the teeth in his mouth. For the skink warriors, the only thing you're really going to pick out so much is going to be the talons on these guys, and once you're done with that, you're ready to move on to your next set of details. Now in this photo, I did kind of make a mistake, and the mistake I made, I forgot to take a photo of burnt umber. I used burnt umber as a base coat. I put 2 thin layers of that stuff on the football that's being caught by the chameleon skink, so I do apologize for that. And once you get that burnt umber down, the next thing you need to work on now is on the ropes and the cabling that's on these characters. Now these Saurus warriors especially have a lot of ropes ripped around their armor panels, around their arms and legs, as well as their tails. It has kind of like this, very much like this Muay Thai style looking of wrapping of ropes in some of these guys. It looks really cool. So for all the rope that's on these people, all you need to do is pick out 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. You can buy that at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And once you're done with that, the next thing you do, of course, is to dry brush the burnt umber on the football that's being caught by the chameleon skink. Just do a simple dry brush for that Territorial Beige as well. As you can see, it's a nice contrasting color to all the flesh that we're using on the miniatures, so that way it picks out a little small detail. And once we're done with that, the next thing you do now is start working on some of the metallics. So the first set of metallics I used was working on the metallics for the skink warriors. So as you can see in this photo, a lot of these skinks have a lot of metallic elements. They have like shoulder pads and shoulder armor. They have like little charms and bracelets and things. At the same time, half of these guys also have these beautiful huge head crests that are used to protect their faces as well. So because of that, what I decided to do is I picked that out in 2 thin layers of Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can find this at your local Walmart. It costs you about 75 cents to purchase this stuff. It's a nice kind of aged gold color. Does a beautiful job on the gold elements. So just pick down 2 thin layers of that Deco Art Emperor's Gold. At the same time, I also picked out some of the silver elements that are on the football that's being caught by the chameleon skink. I used gunmetal gray for that. It's a beautiful dark gunmetal color that's made by Folk Art. Runs at 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just put 2 thin layers on the spikes as well as the stitching on the football, and you're ready to move on. And the last thing I did, of course, is I added a final element, which is Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. I used this for the eyes of the chameleon skinks. The chameleon skinks have really small beady eyes because they're chameleons, and that sky blue is a nice contrasting color to the orange of their flesh. I just put 2 thin dots of sky blue on their eyes, and you're ready to move on. So the next thing we did real quick, of course, is we did a quick dry brush. I dry brushed the gold elements of the miniatures with Anniversary Silver Anniversary by Folk Art. It's a nice, very bright silver color. And the reason why I did a dry brushing on that is because that dry brushing with the silver makes the gold look more vibrant and shimmering, and it looked really nice as well. It's a really neat little trick to use for gold elements. So I just did a really quick dry brushing with that. And then the last thing I did, of course, is I also picked out some of the cording that's connected to the headdresses of the skinks. The skinks are wearing these head crests with these like mandible guards on their jaws, and they have a little bit of stitching to connect the two. So because that, to create that contrast, to bring out that detail, I just picked out those 2 thin details and 2 thin layers of bright blue, because the bright blue contrasts nicely with the yellow and the gold of the headdresses. And then from there, we're moving on to our Saurus warriors. So for the Saurus Warriors, we're using exactly the same color schemes as we did for the Skinks as well. So for all the gold armored elements these guys are wearing, we picked those on 2 thin layers of Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. It does a beautiful, vibrant job and actually contrasts quite nicely with the blue, the green of the flesh of the Saurus Warriors as well. At the same time, the Saurus Warriors also have some silver elements as well. They have rings around their spines, as well as charms on their bodies, as well as bladed spikes at the tip of their tail. So I picked those on 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art, and I did that for most of them. The King Captain, though, we kept his tail golden color because my buddy Senior Chang, which is my friend who actually wants to play this team in our league, he wanted to keep his team captain just a little bit different from the rest of his team, and who am I to argue with that? So as you can see there, that's what we do. That just put 2 thin layers of all the metallic elements, and they're ready to move on. Now, one of the last elements that we did, of course, is we picked out some more fine details that are on these miniatures for the Saurus Warriors specifically. Some of these Saurus Warriors are wearing necklaces with these like little jade talents that are hanging off their necklaces. So for those little jade talents we saw there, we picked out 2 thin layers of lime sherbet, so that way you can see that detail on their chest armor. At the same time, we also did exactly the same color using Tahitian blue by Delta Cerncoat for some of the other players as well. So that way there's some variety of the charms that are hanging around their necks, so that way it's not all monotonous. And once we're done with that, next we're going to work on now are the turn move counters, as well as the coins. So the next thing we're working on now for the next few slides are the turn counters as well as the Blood Bowl coins. And like I said before, these are largely gold. So because I use Emperor's Gold by Deco Art in order to do that, just put 2 thin layers of this stuff all over the coins, all over the turn markers. Just don't need to be particularly neat at this point. You just need to make sure you have a good solid base coat of 2 thin layers of Emperor's Gold. And then from there, you're ready to move on to a dry brush. And once again, we dry brush these gold elements with Silver Anniversary by Folk Art. And as you can see here, this is what I was talking about with where it creates that shimmering look on the gold elements. So just by doing a quick dry brush with this Silver Anniversary on these largely gold miniatures, it does a really nice job of bringing out the vibrancy of that gold. Makes it look like it's really shimmering in the light, which is really, really nice. Makes it look really, really shiny, which is really cool. And it's like one of the nice elements I've discovered with this, which is kind of great because there's a lot of gold in this team, and it's a nice way to bring out that vibrancy. So next what we're going to do now is start working on some of the finer details around the turn markers specifically. As you can see, I'm pretty much using the same colors I've used before for pretty much most of the miniatures. As you can see, I'm using Tahitian blue, Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint, costs 50 cents at the local Walmart, lime sherbet, as well as Anita's True Red. I'm just picking out different gemstones, like for example, I used the Tahitian blue on the chin as well as the cheeks of the slan. I use the Kiwi on the feathers that they have. I use the True Red for the gemstones on the head crest as well as their eyes. At the same time, I also use the lime sherbet on the gemstones that are hanging off their belts as well. Just put 2 thin layers of those colors to pick out those details, and the next thing you need to work on is our very last metallic element. So the very last metallic element that I picked on these guys are the belts. So around the belts in the midsection of these slant turn counters are these chains that they actually wear as belts. I just picked out 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art to add some contrast between the gold elements as well as the silver elements on this miniature. And once you're done putting those 2 thin layers on, next thing we're going to work on now are on the Blood Bowl coins. So for the Blood Bowl coins, as you can see here on the little Lizardman symbol, I pretty much use the same colors we've been using this entire time for the entire team. I've been using Tahitian blue, also using True Red by Anita's Acrylic, lime sherbet by Apple Barrel, same thing with winter green by Apple Barrel as well. And that's what I've used. The Apple Barrel, the winter green Apple Barrel paint, I actually use that to pick out the individual gemstones that actually surround the perimeter of the coin. As for the Lizardman that's actually in the middle there, the little totem, I picked out 2 thin layers of Tahitian blue, and I picked out the little head crest that's on those guys with 2 thin layers of True Red by Anita's Acrylic. And then finally, the last few elements are left, things like the gemstones on the forehead, as well as like little feather icons that are next to the emblem in the center. I picked those out 2 thin layers of lime sherbet. And I pretty much use the same exact colors on the flip side of the coin as well. I use Tahitian blue to pick out the football icon. I use Anita's Acrylic to pick out the upper left hand corner B abbreviation, and lime sherbet for the lower right hand corner B as well. And then I also put a single 2 dots of winter green on all the gemstones that make up the perimeter of the Blood Bowl coin as well. And finally, the last element that I use 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray on these coins as well. And the reason why is because it's for the football icon. The football icon has like 2 stripes of color that's used on the football to represent the spikes that are usually found on a Blood Bowl football. Just put 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray to add some contrast to that, and we are done with the coins and the turn markers. We're also done with most of the work on the Lizardmen. Next thing we need to do now is start working on the bases. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do now is work on the bases of these miniatures. Now for those of you guys who are longtime viewers of the channel, you guys have known I've actually painted up a Lizardman army for our studio, and in our Lizardman army we actually went with like his kind of like this Badlands kind of like mud flat base that we used for the miniatures, and I decided to carry on that kind of look for the Lizardmen as well. So what I do is I just basically covered the entire base in 2 thin layers of burnt sienna by Folk Art. It's a nice vibrant reddish brown color that looks very much like clay and like mud, which is really good color to use, and it also contrasts very nicely with all the greens and the blues that we have on these miniatures as well. And we just put 2 thin layers all over the texturing on the bases. We let it dry. Next thing we need to do now is a dry brush. So after we get done with the burnt sienna, the next thing we need to do now is dry brush the bases with terracotta. It's another color by Folk Art, runs you 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And as you can see in this photo, I just did a quick dry brush real fast all over the texturing that we painted earlier with burnt sienna. It creates this nice little vibrancy and creates some highlights with the texturing, leaving the burnt sienna in the recesses and the terracotta on the raised surface in the miniature as well. Also gives you this clue, its idea that they're running across mud flats, which is really neat, which is something we like using for our Lizardman army. And it looks really great because it contrasts nicely with the rest of the greens and the golds, the greens, the golds, and the blues of the miniatures as well. And once we're done with that dry brushing, next thing we need to do now is to do an oil wash. So like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a quick paint method, which means that all we need to do is base coat and then dry brush our base coats, and then we do an all over oil wash using an oil wash. Now in this case, we like to use Midwax Polyshades Mission Oak color. You can find this stuff at your local Walmart. It costs you about $6.99 for a can of this stuff at your hardware department of Walmart. And the reason why we use Midwax Polyshades is because it does exactly the same thing as Army Painter Strong Tone or Army Painter Soft Tone. Army Painter Strong Tone and Soft Tone are wonderful products. They do exactly as they're advertised. The only problem though is that stuff costs about $32 per can, whereas this stuff at Walmart costs only $6.99. That's the reason why we like using it, and it does exactly the same thing as well. All you need to do is you take your poly shades, you mix it with some paint thinner to whatever degree of darkness or lightness that you want for your wash, and once you're happy with the result that you have, you just take that wash and you just paint it all over the entirety of your miniatures as well as the bases that they stand on. The oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing that the oil wash does, it actually creeps into the recesses of the miniature and brings out a lot of those details that we didn't see before with the base coating as well as the dry brushing. At the same time, the poly shades, because it's being an oil wash, it smooths over the transitions between the dry brushing as well as the base coating on the miniatures. If you guys noticed in the earlier slides, the miniatures had a very much a chalky kind of pastel finish on these miniatures, and the reason why is because of the dry brushing. The oil washing smooths out those transitions and blends the dry brushing with the base coating and makes it look really nice as well, and looks almost kind of seamless, and that's a really nice part about the oil washing. And the last thing that it does as well is it also darkens down the color that's on the miniatures as well. Like we said before, the oil wash does draw down the value of the brightness of the colors that we're using, and that's the reason why we use such bright colors in the earlier stages, because this oil wash will darken it down. Now this poly shade is a mixture of stain as well as polyurethane, so because of that, you do have to let this stuff dry as well as cure. I suggest that you let it dry and cure for 24 hours. So if you do miniatures painting in your free time, make this the very last step of a day's worth of painting, and then wait an entire day to the next day to pick it up and to paint again. And the reason why is because if you mess with this stuff while it's still kind of tacky, you could strip off the miniatures, paint on the miniatures, and it could ruin your finish on that one. So once you're done with that, once it dries and cures, however, you will have this high gloss sheen on your miniature. Now some people do like that high gloss finish on their miniatures. I specifically don't so much, so because of that, this next step is a matte spray for matte varnish. You can skip this step if you want to, but that's what I'm going to do. So the next step, which is completely optional, is to spray miniatures with a matte spray. In my case, I like to use Krylon matte spray. I can get this at $5.99 at my local Walmart. And all I do is just do the once over the entirety of the miniatures as well. As you can see, that matte varnish actually really suppresses the sheen that we have from the polyurethane, from the stain that we used earlier. And so that way it brings out all those details that we couldn't see before. And once you're done with that matte spray, next thing you do now is to finish the bases. Now, for my miniatures, I like to use flocking for these guys because they are plain Blood Bowl. All I do is I just take some wood glue, paint it onto the bases where I want the flocking to go, and then I dust them with some homemade flock. The homemade flock that we use on my channel is actually sawdust is what we use. Iron Major and I actually know a guy who actually does a lot of cabinetry and carpentry work here in the town that we live in. So because he's got like just tons of sawdust, and he lets us use it whenever we want to, which is awesome. So all we do is we just take the sawdust, we sift it, we You dye it with different cheap acrylic paints, let it dry, crumple it up again, and you have homemade flock. So all I do is I just dust this homemade flock all over the parts of the miniature that I want to be made, and then bam, my flocking is done. Now, of course, you could use store-bought, pre-made flocking if you want to. There's a lot of companies that do. Woodland Scenics, Army Painter, even Games Workshop. There's also a lot of independent companies that make this stuff. It's entirely up to you how you want to do it. Me though, since I have access to the homemade flock, that's what I use. And once we're done with that, the last thing we do now is to paint the rims of the bases. So the next thing we need to do now, of course, is to paint the rim of the bases. What I do is I just use 2 thin layers of Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice, bright, vibrant green. That's the same kind of green that we've been using for all the bases of our miniatures for Blood Bowl, and it looks absolutely fantastic when it's done. And once you're done doing that rimming of the bases, you're completely finished with your Gwaka'Moli Crater Gators. And once again, this is the end result that we have from the miniatures, and this is exactly what they look like if you decide to use our Cheapskate method. As you can see, as a beautiful tabletop standard, the colors are nice, vibrant, and at the same time, you save yourself a ton of money by doing it this way. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now is actually go through a shopping list of materials that you need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to paint it exactly the same way we did, but using those products instead. So with that being said, let's get that shopping list on a roll. So this is the list of items you'll need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to paint up your team exactly the same way we did using their products. So the first thing you'll need to do, of course, is a Priming Miniatures and Corax White Spray. That's going to cost you $17. At the same time, if you also want to do things like all the yellow elements, you'll need to use Hexo Pale Sun to do the dry brushing for that, as well as Everland Sunset for do all the little yellow details as well for the base coat. After that, you'll also need to use Militarum Green, Vulcan Green in order to do some of the green elements on the miniatures as well. Fulcrum Pink for do the dry brushing for the miniatures too. You'll need to use Teclis Blue for like things the finer details are done in blue. Same thing with Caliban Green for a lot of the back scales of the miniatures as well. Screamer Pink for all the elements that we did in magenta. You'll need to purchase Luganeth Orange for all the dry brushing that we did for the orange elements. Wild Rider Red for the dry brushing all the red elements, as well as Cyberite Green for all the dry brushing for the green elements of the miniature. You also need to buy Blue Horror for the dry brushing for all the blue elements as well. Now, as for the parts that we did in Burnt Umber, you'll need to buy Wildwood, which runs you $7.80. And it should be mentioned that all the other paints I just listed prior to Wildwood cost you $4.55 for each of those. So keep that in mind. For the Bellin elements, you need to use Morghast Bone, which costs you $4.55. For the parts that we did for the cabling and the roping on these miniatures, you need to buy Baylor Brown, which is $4.55 for that. For the green soft scales for the Croxagore, you'll need to buy Gauss Blaster Green, runs at $4.55 for that color. And as for the gym shorts these guys are wearing, you'll need to buy Eshin Gray, which is at $4.55 for that color as well. Now for the Flesh of the Chameleon Skinks, you'll need to buy Troll Slayer Orange, runs at $4.55 for that. And for all the teal colors that we use for the flesh for most of the Swords Warriors, you need to buy Baharoth Blue, which runs at $4.55 for that as well. Now for the red elements, you'll need to buy a pot of Mephiston Red, which costs you $4.55. And then for the head crests of the Skinks, you need to buy a pot of Rakarth Flesh, which runs you $4.55 for that as well. Now for the metallic elements, for the silver parts that we did for the darker silver, you need to buy Lead Belcher. And for the silver elements that we did for the dry brushing, you need to buy Ironbreaker, and both those cost $7.80 for those colors. Now for the bases, you need to buy Doom Bull Brown for the basing work. That costs you $4.55 for that. And then you'll need to dry brush that with Squig Orange, which costs you $4.55 for that color. Now for the dry brushing on the black elements, you'll need to buy a pot of Ulthuan Gray, which runs you $4.55 for that color. And for the dry brushing that we used on the flesh of the back scales of the miniatures for the Swords Warriors in blue, you need to buy Aethermatic Blue, which is $7.80 for that color. Now for the golden elements on the miniature, you'll need to buy a pot of Retributor Armor, which is $7.80 for that color as well. Now because this is a quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is $32 for that. And if you decide to do the matte spray, you'll need to buy a can of Munitorum Varnish, which is $19.50. And assuming, of course, that you're going to flock your miniatures, you need to buy Army Painter Basing Set, runs $18.90 for the flocking on that, as well as some wood glue and stuff like that in order to do that. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything from Citadel and Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $223.34 to paint up your miniatures using those products the same way that we did. Now, when you compare that with the Cheapskate method, which is $33.17, and you subtract the two, you're talking about a grand total savings of $190.17. So that's correct, almost $200 worth of savings by going with the Cheapskate method. So if you're a brand new painter and you're looking for a way to cheaply paint up your miniatures because you don't want to spend that much money to paint up a team that only costs $35 on Amazon, my suggestion, go with the craft paints. much cheaper, much more feasible. So that's good to do for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good to do for this one, you guys. We will see you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay classy.